OpenAI was founded on optimistic ideas that AI could make the world a better place and that a nonprofit organization was the best way to achieve that vision. With news of the CEO's ouster this week, leaving the company on shaky ground, we're going to discuss whether the company's unique structure meant it was doomed to fail, and whether the structure was a result of earnest optimism or more cynical intentions.
Later in the episode, we will discuss what the CBC expose on Buffy Sainte-Marie left out in the quest for a clean story, and why some mental health treatments for teens are backfiring, leaving kids worse off than before.
I'm Kier.
And I'm Liam.
And this is Hot Take Think Tank.
So, let's get into the OpenAI story. I do feel like we have to caveat that we're recording on Tuesday, and it'll go up on Friday, and this story has changed every single day since it began. But I think we can keep focus on the very interesting things that have happened so far, and stick to the big ideas more than the minutia of who's meeting with who on which afternoons. But I thought first, Kira, I'm curious if you use ChatGPT.
I do use it a little bit here and there. I'm not very good at social media, so sometimes I use it to sort of generate ideas of like how to turn, essays into bits of content. But in general, I feel like I haven't quite figured out what it's useful for me.
Totally. Yeah, I have figured out what it's useful for me, and I do now pony up the $20 a month for the pro version. And I use it pretty much every workday. I program for a living, and it does a ton of programming right alongside me. I don't have like a formal education in programming, so it knows a lot more than I do about a lot of things. So in that way, you and I are sort of part of OpenAI's downfall because because we kind of contributed to it having to transition from like a research organization into a consumer platform, which maybe is not what it was set up for, and maybe things have gone very awry.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't think I necessarily had heard of OpenAI before ChatGPT, but ChatGPT really did take the world by storm.
Yeah, I think by some measures it's like the fastest growing like consumer platform that the world has ever seen.
Wow.
There's currently 100 million weekly active users. So it's on the scale of something like a Pokemon Go, bigger, and maybe people are using it for more important things than that. But the article in particular we wanted to talk about was published by Ben Thompson on Stratechery, called OpenAI's Misalignment and Microsoft's Gain. And in it, he sort of goes through a business analysis approach to what has happened, which is, like we said, the CEO being ousted by the board. And the theory he puts forward basically is that when OpenAI was set up as a nonprofit, that sort of planted some seeds of instability that a for-profit company wouldn't have had, and that that is what led us to where we are today, which is just a company in total turmoil, lots of uncertainty. And Microsoft, the biggest investor in OpenAI, seeming to be in a decent position to sort of absorb the platform product people from OpenAI and most of the researchers, sort of turning what was a nonprofit company into a division of the biggest for-profit company around.
And without like paying for it, right?
Totally, yeah.
Just this quiet absorption.
Right. That it sort of self-destructed, and now is suddenly looking for a home, any home, and Microsoft is the clear partner because they had made a huge investment in the company sort of a few years ago, which OpenAI needed so that it could access the GPUs, so that it could do the stuff and the research that they needed to do. But sort of in that agreement, Microsoft got licenses for all of the intellectual property of OpenAI. So it's a very natural home for if everyone needs to quit OpenAI and get hired somewhere else, Microsoft is sort of the clear home for where they will go next.
Yeah. Like if I understand correctly, like the idea behind having OpenAI be a nonprofit was that it would be unchained to a profit motive, right? That
Right.
it would set its own principles and those principles would guide the decisions that it would make. Which sounds good, right? But I think
Totally.
there is a weakness that I hadn't thought of, which is that, you know, if you are a nonprofit, you're going
Hmm.
to attract a lot less money because people aren't going to be making money through you. And
Right.
so you are going to be reliant on a for profit company to provide some of the resources and infrastructure that you need.
Hmm.
Um, if you have a product as successful and as suddenly successful as ChatGPT was.
Yeah, totally. It's sort of it's an interesting case where there was this idealism. We can get into later how earnest it was, but this idealism, right? That they didn't want to create this amazing new technology inside of a company that had to be responsive to shareholders or whatever, because especially if there's ever like an artificial general intelligence, which is what they're working on. The idea is that sort of entity could be so powerful and exert such economic force on the world that like being carefully managed by thoughtful people would be important, and needing to respond to the shareholders to make the most money could lead things astray.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it does seem like sort of the company split into a couple of tribes around ChatGPT, where sort of it went from being this low profile in terms of like customer facing things company that did a lot of research, and then suddenly they have like the biggest app of the year, the biggest leap forward in consumer tech in like 15 years or something like that. And so suddenly they have it came out of Silicon Valley with the CEO Sam Altman being very invested in a lot of different startups, sort of treating the company now like a startup, right? How can we grow it? How can we get more people using the software? How can we make money off the software? And this other tribe of of OpenAI, sorry, that is still like focused on what the founding documents of it said, which is like, our goal is to do this, at a reasonable pace and with safety as the guiding principle of the whole thing.
Right, because I think like the main distinction of the two tribes within the organization were sort of the accelerationists who were more optimistic about like what will come out of AI and how great it will be. And
Hmm.
then you had the, you know, you could call them the doomers who are much very concerned about like what artificial intelligence could do to us if it's not done properly, you know, and
Totally.
you could probably, you know, I don't want to like caricaturize either of them, right? But that's like a really significant tension within an organization.
Totally. Well, and there's almost like an irony to it, where the whole point of it was that they didn't want this development process to fall into the hands of like a super accelerationist, move fast and break things kind of corporate culture. But there's so much market demand for, right? ChatGPT is wildly profitable. Every company in the world is like reorganizing, trying to like come up with an AI strategy. Like there's such economic forces pushing this idea and this research and these large language models around, that it's almost like it's almost irresistible, right, for the people who are at the wheel. Like, sort of, could they, the board members tried on Friday to slam on the brakes, and it looks like they will have failed completely. Like, there was never a chance of actually slamming on the brakes with this
Mm.
sort of thing. Like, there's just too the incentives are too great to spread it far and wide. Uh, the idea that like writing down very good words at the start of it could somehow overcome the tremendous like financial pressures that would come later.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Seems a little. Uh, it's funny in like now. It's very easy to be like, oh, it seems a little naive to think that, but I don't remember reading widely people beforehand worrying about it. I don't know. It seems, yeah, naive in retrospect, but at the time, uh, I don't know. I like, 2 weeks ago, no one was like, "Oh, I'm really worried that OpenAI is a nonprofit and it's not going to explode," and then
No,
it did.
absolutely. One of the more interesting things and surprising things to me with the Ben Thompson article that you're talking
Hmm.
about is that he really found it almost concerning that Sam Altman did not own any equity in the company. And
Yeah.
it seemed to me that Thompson seems to think that, like, that is something that really incentivizes CEOs to act in the best interests of the company. And that
Right.
absent that, like, maybe that gave Sam Altman like more leeway to kind of do what he wanted or something like that. And I wasn't
Yeah.
sure how to feel about that because I do feel like
Yeah.
people are capable of, pursuing a goal without, owning
Hmm.
equity in the company. But
Totally.
at the same time, like if you're the only company not doing that,
Mm.
maybe that creates like a dynamic in Silicon Valley that I don't understand very well.
Yeah, I think it's sort of funny because that was sort of his criticism of the OpenAI structure before Friday. Like that was the worry he had. He did not foresee this whole collapse coming. But yeah, I remember him talking about the same sort of thing to do with Mark Zuckerberg back around 2015, 2016. People were very worried about how he was leading Facebook. I guess they still are today, aren't they? But I remember he had taken solace in the fact that um, Zuckerberg has his personal fortune all tied up with Facebook, and then that would mean, of the whole realm of things that Zuckerberg might do, it was at least constrained to things that wouldn't destroy his fortune.
Right.
Right. And that it's not, there's not like, I don't think he's fully on board with the idea that, like creating shareholder value is the best thing anyone can ever do. But I
Mm-hmm.
think it's more just like in terms of creating like stable institutions of society, being able to trust people to act in their own best interests makes dealing with them a lot more clear. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of come to bear on this, not in the way he anticipated, right? But right, Microsoft was signing huge deals with this entity. Um, it seems without the caution of like, wait, but this entity, most companies that you do deals with, if you sign papers saying like, we'll give you $1 billion if you do this for us, you can be pretty darn sure they're going to do that for you. But when
Hmm.
it's a nonprofit, there's you kind of can't be so sure, right?
Hmm. That's interesting because nonprofits do have a lot of transparency. They have to have a lot of transparency around like their
Totally.
finances and that sort of thing. But you think that those mechanisms aren't as strong?
Well, it's they're sort of strong for different things. Like the mechanisms around nonprofit transparency, I think, are mostly to like report to the state, right? That we're not, a fake nonprofit. We are actually doing something. We deserve our tax exempt status, that sort of thing. But when it's like the interface between a nonprofit and a business,
Hmm.
it's a lot harder to take those guarantees because the nonprofit has explicitly said we care about something else more than we care about your money, right?
Right.
So Microsoft trying to be like, well, they'll never back out of this deal. We were giving them this much money. Most cases, businesses can rely on that, right? Like, Samsung manufactures the phone screens for iPhones. They're the two biggest phone manufacturers. They're competitors, but
Hmm.
Apple's willing to write the giant check for Samsung, and Samsung's a profit-driven company, so Apple can rely on them, right? But if Samsung was like a nonprofit, then they could, without any repercussions, right? No shareholder complaints or anything, they could just say, "We're not going to do that anymore." Um,
Hmm.
so it's just sort of like the reliability or stability that that profit motive can provide.
Well, I
Uh,
do feel though that like Elon Musk is such a counterexample when it comes to Twitter, right? Because
oh, totally, yeah.
he doesn't seem to care if it dies. Like he seems to be a lot more concerned about molding it in his
Yeah,
image than like it being a successful company. So I wonder
totally.
if there's like a cap on it. Like once
Yes.
you lose your mind after your third billion or whatever, and
That's pretty
then
much, that did, Ben Thompson did get there with his Mark Zuckerberg analysis, because he was saying all these things sort of before the 2016 election happened. And he's like, well,
Hmm.
I'm glad that Mark's just staying above the fray and he's not getting involved in any of this fake news stuff or whatever. But yeah, when you're that rich, sometimes you get into the fray and you're like, well, maybe this is going to cost, you know, maybe I'll take a 10% hit on my $100 billion estate or whatever. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's true. It's only works to a point, and particularly the. I mean, I guess this whole discussion is about the boringness of various corporate structures. When Twitter was a public company, before Elon Musk bought it, it had like a widely understood fiduciary duty to all of its shareholders. So if they had
Hmm.
made calamitous mistakes costing shareholder values, they could have like gone to court for it. But now that it's sole proprietorship, Elon's the only guy who owns all of the shares. They're sort of no longer that duty. And the odd case with Facebook is the way it was set up. Even though they sold equity shares, they didn't sell voting shares. So the CEO, Mark
Right.
Zuckerberg, still has full control over all the decisions of the company. There's no way for shareholders to sort of overrule him, even if they think he's making a bad economic decision.
Right. Yeah. And Elon Musk does come into this story, right? Because he's a
He does.
co founder alongside Sam Altman of OpenAI. And
Hmm.
Thompson makes mention of the fact that perhaps the nonprofit status was a lot more cynical or strategic than a lot of people realize. Can you explain that?
Yeah, totally. So the idea is that both Altman and Musk are like big people in tech, right? They own a lot of equity in tech companies. Uh, Elon Musk, obviously, with Tesla, and Sam Altman through various. He was part of Y Combinator, which is like a startup incubator. So he had small shares in a lot of smaller tech firms. And the idea is that if AI is to be like this future big deal, right? Like being good at AI means you win, being bad at it means you lose, sort of. The companies they invested in needed to find like their edge in the AI wars against Facebook and Google, which their edge is very obvious that they have a ridiculous amount of data, like more than any startup company could ever hope to have. And so the idea that Thompson puts forward was that the edge that they found was this nonprofit angle, right?
Hmm.
That if they pitched to, the PhDs and researchers, the people who are going to make these breakthroughs, that, sure, you could work at Google where they have all the data, or you could work here at a nonprofit where we'll pay you lots and you don't have to worry, you can sleep soundly at night because, it says in our charter that we will be really good about this and everything's going to be fine.
Yeah, like giving people the opportunity to like work somewhere that might feel more aligned with their values or what their hopes are for
Hmm.
how AI will play out in the world. Like that's really alluring, and I think it's almost disarming as well. Like I remember when I
Yeah,
learned that OpenAI was a nonprofit, I suddenly felt like softer towards it, right? Like a bit warmer.
totally.
Like, oh, this is different, and so watching
Yeah.
all this go down lately, I don't know. It's like I hope it's not like the death of experimentation, with
Yeah.
tech and research companies. Like, and one thing you told me that I
Hmm.
like blew my mind was that Sam Altman actually went to the government first, right? And
Right. Yeah.
proposed for this company to be publicly owned.
Totally. I remember because they've had to do like a few iterations on this nonprofit thing to find a way to like raise the capital that they needed to make the whole thing happen. And I remember, yeah, hearing interviews with him around that time when he was doing the press tour explaining the weird new capped profit thing that he'd set up. Yeah, saying that he'd brought it to like the Department of Defense and the government broadly, saying like we think that this is going to be a huge impact on how the future of the world develops, and we think maybe the government would be the best home for this project. And the government said, No, thank you. That's not the sort of thing we do, right? Because it was back in 2014 or 2015 that he was going around with that. So it was a good 8 or 9 years out to the sort of breakthrough like ChatGPT.
Right. It probably sounded like pretty out there at the time. And there
Totally.
also seems to be like, we see when Mark Zuckerberg gets, called in for
Mm.
what's it called? Like a grand jury.
Right.
What's the
Yeah.
word?
Congressional hearing sort of thing.
Yeah, a hearing like that a lot of the people asking questions have no idea what they're talking about. So,
Totally.
I can't help but wonder like if the government representatives that Altman was meeting with just like
Mm.
really couldn't like understand really what he was talking about.
Totally. Yeah. I've got to think that the culture Altman is used to in Silicon Valley, where you go around pitching your wild ideas to raise millions of dollars on a moonshot or whatever, it completely misaligns with how governments are used to like allocating tax money.
Totally.
Maybe reasonably so.
Well, maybe, but at the same time, like people do have a lot of concerns around, the amount of power that a company like Google or Facebook
Totally.
has like in our, politics. So, yeah, I'm intrigued by that idea, and it would have been like an audacious choice for the government to make in a lot of ways to
Yeah.
say yes, but I just
Well, like
wonder, yeah, what that would
I,
have looked like.
yeah, I just used the phrase moonshot for what Silicon Valley likes, but the original moonshot was going to the moon, which
Right.
was a government program, right? That spent billions and billions of dollars on,
Exactly.
a wild and, I mean, there's no clear financial return on that one. I guess it tied into the Cold War, so it was an easier sell, but it's not like it's never happened before. The government putting billions of dollars into funding like a scientific breakthrough of one kind or another.
Yeah.
But yeah, they missed their chance with this one, and Microsoft did it.
Mm-hmm. So has this
Yeah,
made you like cynical in general about nonprofits and in the tech industry, or do you think we'll still
interesting.
continue to see like innovation in that sense?
Um, I mean, I like reading the news about it with how important ChatGPT has become to like my workday. I was pretty just like I don't know, kind of worried. Like are they blowing this right? Like they've
Mm-hmm.
provided like a huge amount of value to me, and uh, it's like I don't know. I do wonder next time if it does happen again, where a nonprofit company springs up with a really compelling product, if that will give me pause about like integrating it into my daily routine, thinking like, you know, will this even if I'm willing to pay my monthly subscription, will they
Mm-hmm.
suddenly decide, the risk of it is too big and they shouldn't take monthly subscriptions anymore, and yank it offline? So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I do want it. It seems like an odd fit. I don't have anything against like nonprofits. I think they make a lot of sense in a lot of places. Even some tech places like Wikipedia, I think makes a lot of sense as it is. But I do, I don't know. It's funny. Like I feel like a lot of people from the start, looking at the team behind OpenAI, were like, this looks like a tech startup in every way other than their weird founding charter. And I think I'd be surprised to see another like clear tech startup wearing nonprofit clothes again.
Yeah, it feels like we might be kind of stuck with the paradigm or the sort of the funding model that we have for startups for a while until someone disrupts it. Yeah.
Totally.
Well, Liam, I wanted to ask you if you could briefly describe the Mission Folk Music Festival for our audience.
Oh yeah, sure. The Mission Folk Music Festival happens in Mission, British Columbia, which is a suburb of Vancouver. A pretty far away suburb. Takes like an hour and a half in bad traffic to get there. But it's this big field that once a year for a weekend, they put up big stages and they have a big camping area and there are booths and there's music. And they get all these acts that you never heard of before from all over the world playing folk music, instruments you've never seen before. Lots of people are smoking pot everywhere, and I think there's some weird backwoods party that I've never been to, but I've heard tell of. And it's mostly you see a lot of gray hair, and I don't know, like it's like a suburban 40 years too late Woodstock kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Tamer, but similar vibes, just as
Yeah.
much tie-dye. Yeah, our parents took us there like basically every year when we were kids, and I continue to go sometimes with our mom. And I saw Buffy Sainte-Marie there
Oh,
in
did you?
2012. I did, yeah. And she was very well received. People were so excited.
I bet. Yeah, that's a pretty big name for the Mission Folk Festival.
It
I
is.
think they'll
It
often have like
absolutely is.
one headliner who you might have heard of, but yeah, she's a big get.
She's a big get. Like, yeah, Buffy Sainte-Marie, at least in Canada, is like an absolute icon. Most people know who she is, and she's just won like countless awards and honors.
Totally.
The one little story I have from that weekend was she was in a workshop, so there were 4 musicians sitting on the stage. And it was like an Indigenous themed panel. And everyone was Indigenous except this one white guy who was Australian, and he had been taught Aboriginal music. And so he was there talking about it. And I noticed Buffy just giving this guy so much stink eye.
Huh.
And like
Interesting.
rolling her eyes when he was talking, and like, I don't know. I feel like I didn't make it up. It really felt like she was very like unimpressed with him being there.
Very much. It sounds like very much like, whoa, you're white.
Yeah.
This isn't your place.
This isn't
That sort of thing?
Yeah, that's what it felt like for sure. And I could see it from the audience, so she wasn't that subtle about it. So that memory really came back, because over about a month ago, the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, came out with sort of this documentary / expose about Buffy Sainte-Marie's ancestry.
Right.
And when it all sort of unfurled, I kind of looked back on that moment and laughed a little bit. Because Buffy has always claimed that she is Indigenous, that she was adopted as a small child and raised by a white family in Massachusetts.
Right.
And her story has shifted in various ways over the years. Sometimes she's said she's adopted. Sometimes she's implied she's the child of an affair. Sometimes she says she knows her birth mother. Sometimes she says she doesn't. Sometimes she says her birth mother died after giving birth. In other ones, her mother just couldn't take care of her, gave her up for adoption. She's also said she's Algonquin. She said she's Mi'kmaq. She said she's Cree. All of these First Nations are in different places.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it wasn't adding up for the reporters and researchers that were involved with the documentary. So, to spoil it, they basically did manage to find her birth certificate. She claimed she did not have a birth certificate, and it shows her to be the daughter of the parents who raised her, both of whom are white and Italian American. And it's pretty convincing, right? Like, even, the clerk who shows the birth certificate shows how, like, these were put in order in the book, right? So it's like the idea that she was adopted, at a later date, like the paperwork would have been in a different spot in the binder. It's just, there's really no like explanation for the birth certificate being specifically where it is, except that she was born there.
It's the sort of scrutiny you'd sort of expect of the CBC. Like, they're not a tabloid or anything who are going to run with like unfounded rumors. It's the sort of thing I don't think they'd broadcast unless they were quite convinced that they were reporting the truth.
I agree. Like, if they got it wrong, it would be like such a huge scandal that like they had to be very sure before they put it out. And yeah, so I really kind of wanted to talk about like the response to the documentary, what was sort of glossed over or left out of the documentary,
Hmm.
and sort of more of the context for it, especially for people who aren't in Canada.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this has kicked up like a lot of controversy, and I think that there's like a very, very mixed response
Mm.
among the general public and among Indigenous people, which some people might find surprising, right? It's like this woman has claimed she's Indigenous. It looks like she's not,
Yeah.
you know, that that seems clear cut in the documentary, but in reality, like there are a lot of Indigenous people coming to her defense. And
Hmm.
part of the reason for that is that Buffy, like in her early 20s, was adopted into a Piapot First Nation family in
Hmm.
Saskatchewan. And I guess under that is a Cree First Nation, and sort of under their adoption and kinship protocols, she is a member of that family. She's a member of that community, and
Yeah.
they consider her to be Indigenous. Um, and I even listened to a podcast, a CBC podcast, that had two
Hmm.
Indigenous artists discussing it. And one of them believes that that makes her Indigenous, the fact that she was adopted into the family of an
Right.
Indigenous nation. The other person says, no, the adoption means she's a member of that family, but that does not make her Indigenous.
Mm.
And they both felt very, very strongly about their positions, right? Um,
Hmm.
and that's like part of the conversation around like indigeneity in Canada, right? Um, I've heard many times that like it's not enough to find, one ancestor in a chart. Being an indigenous is a lot to do with reciprocity. It's a lot to do with belonging
Hmm.
and like being claimed, right? Like if you
Right.
are a tiny bit indigenous, but you've never, ever, ever been to your territory, you've never met anyone who lives there,
Mm.
then, you know, are you really a community member? Can you really claim that community as being yours?
Right.
And so that's what's
Right.
so
So is
confusing about this.
totally is Buffy somehow more indigenous than some people who our traditional Western ideas would be like, oh, that person is, the son or daughter of two indigenous people, so they are indigenous. But
Hmm.
if they, live in the big city or don't stay in touch with their family or anything, yeah. It's an interesting sort of perspective shift.
Yeah, yeah, because I do think that adoption really does mean a lot to some people, right? Like that
Hmm.
adoption means, like, yes, she is Indigenous. Um, so, yeah, I think it's like what really was left out of the CBC documentary was like the complexity of the understandings of Indigenous identity and citizenship.
Right.
And so they really, they didn't interview the Piapot family. They did show a letter that was written by them,
Hmm.
but they really sort of skated over that. And to an extent, I get that, right? Because their point was, if we're talking about blood and genetics and family trees,
Yeah.
Buffy Sainte-Marie is not Indigenous. But the adoption was really just sort of very, very underplayed in the documentary
Hmm.
because that was their focus, right?
Yeah.
And this kicked up a lot for a lot of people, right? You'd think the birth certificate is like the smoking gun,
Hmm.
but you have had a lot of Indigenous people coming out of the woodwork, adoptees who said, my birth certificate was falsified. My birth
Right.
certificate was fabricated. My parents were taken off of my birth certificate and my adopted parents were put on it. And I only realized
Yeah.
that decades later. And then you have like, I may be getting into the nitty gritty here, but you also have like people have been stripped of their status, right? Like the
Yeah.
Indian Act from 1876, if a woman married a non Indigenous man, she lost her status. Any person who obtained a university degree lost their status. Anyone who
Hmm.
served in the armed forces lost their status.
Wow.
And some of these people have now had it reinstated. But yeah, so and you even have nations that the government doesn't recognize. And
Right.
so if you're a member of one of those nations, like you aren't indigenous according to the government, right?
Hmm.
So it is like a lot more complex than the documentary suggested. And yeah, that's kind of why it kicked up so much controversy for people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting. I feel like it gets at a lot of the sort of things we like to talk about. I mean, I guess around identity, which I think. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like we both have a bit of an aversion to like identity politics, in the way it's like currently, I don't know, taking over the left wing of the political spectrum. But
Mhm.
I don't know. This does strike me as a more interesting example where identity, uh, it doesn't feel like it's being like falsely elevated as a, you know, something that isn't actually that important that people are blowing out of proportion for political reasons. This does seem like a genuinely, uh, I don't know, sort of important distinction, especially if you want to like let people, uh, you know, there's just so much history to it of colonial powers like overruling how things how people want to do how people want to define this sort of thing. So that it's like
Exactly.
a murky, very murky waters for the
Right.
government to be like, ah, this person is not indigenous, and we figured that out, and case closed.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, it's if we are working towards like indigenous sovereignty, does that not mean that we have to respect adoption protocols, like whether or not we agree with them, right?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so one of the articles I found really interesting on all of this was called "What's the Point of Pretendian Investigations" by
Mm-hmm.
Michelle Saika on the Walrus. And I found some parts that I agreed with and some parts I didn't.
Hmm.
I think that like she really laid out the complexity of Indigenous citizenship and how much that was glossed over by the CBC. But I did disagree with some of her ideas on the role of a journalist because
Hmm.
she did sort of talk about like the turmoil and the harm that is being done with this story. And
Yeah.
I do think that that pain is real because Buffy, I think whether or not people are mad at her right now, almost everyone agrees that she was a total trailblazer, right? Like she was like the
Right.
first Indigenous woman to win a Grammy. She opened so many doors. Apparently, she's largely responsible for the Junos, a Canadian Music
Hmm.
Award, having an
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous category. Like there's like tangible effects, tangible opportunities for Indigenous people now that
Mm-hmm.
are a result of her activism. And so that's what's, you know, kind of so heartbreaking for people. But I think like for me, like I do feel really compelled towards the truth, and I think that like
Mm-hmm.
journalism is often upsetting, you know, like when
Totally.
investigations happen, like they can be really devastating for people, and I don't think that that's a reason for them not to happen.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that. That this article in particular, it did keep, I don't know, placing at the feet of the journalists what I felt like was rightly, I don't know, ire that you could feel towards Buffy Sainte-Marie. Just
Hmm.
like that by lying about this stuff, she was like setting an investigation like this on its path to happen eventually.
Hmm.
Right? Like that it's not the journalist's fault for discovering these things, but if she had been truthful, there wouldn't have been anything to discover, and none of
Exactly,
this would be
right?
happening, right? Like it's a weird.
It's like the don't shoot the messenger, right? It's like
Yeah, yeah, totally.
yeah, absolutely. Um, I think another layer to this that I wanted to point out, like it does come into like um, cancellation and witch hunts and this sort of
Hmm.
thing too, because there are some like really um, intense advocates of, unmasking Pretendians out there,
Right.
one of whom is interviewed in the documentary series. Jacqueline Keeler is a controversial figure.
Yeah.
She released a list in 2021 of alleged Pretendians that had about 200 public figures on it. And there were a number of people who subsequently provided paperwork proving that she
Right.
got it wrong.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this person was on the list, but there's Cree Métis artist Isque, and she was falsely accused of being a Pretendian. And you can imagine like the effect that that would have on your career, right? Like you would
Totally.
very
Yeah.
easily get like disinvited from everything, shunned, just like completely shut out.
Yeah.
And like thankfully in her case, basically like her status card had expired as as
Right.
they can, and so she had to like reapply so that she could provide it as evidence to the public that she is indeed Red River Métis. But that's some of the danger. Like you might think like, why would any Indigenous person be against this type of unmasking? And the answer is that like people are tired of so much scrutiny, right? The scrutiny that
Totally.
like they live with every day. And so to have like white CBC journalists like doing this type of work is going to be offensive to some people, especially if like innocent people get caught up in the crossfire.
Totally. It weirdly, in my mind, there's like parallels between this. Not everything is parallel here, but between sort of the idea that the TERF movement or whatever, the trans exclusionary feminists, how that movement is so damaging to cis women as well, in that you kind of can't tell by looking at someone whether they're trans or not, and
Mm-hmm.
suddenly cis women also will be like subjected to these like weird tests that like they shouldn't, like for many reasons people shouldn't have to like prove their biological sex, but that it's
Yeah.
that yeah, when you start, when you bring in this I don't know, this question of like, you have to be, you can't just look this way, you have to be this way in some
Yeah. You have to
deeper
prove
deeper
it
way. You have to
too,
prove
right?
it, right? Whereas your
Yeah.
card that shows you're woman at birth or indigenous at birth, uh
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
but they feel obviously very different in that trans women aren't lying about being women to get
Mm-hmm.
benefits,
Mm-hmm.
whereas I guess that's the accusation against people saying that they're indigenous falsely, that they might be trying to benefit somehow.
Yeah, well, yeah, Saika kind of gets to this at the end of her article where she kind of talks about how, like, kind of picking off one Pretendian at a time is not like getting at the crux of the issue because, you
Yeah.
know, basically over the last, I'm not sure, maybe decade, there are like more and more opportunities for Indigenous people. There's more, jobs and grants and awards and honors that are particularly for Indigenous people.
Yeah.
And so that has largely been based solely on self identification. Like you check the box and that's that.
Yeah.
That's as far as the investigation has gone. And that's caused a lot of really embarrassing situations for various organizations as people
Mm-hmm.
have been revealed to have no Indigenous ancestry.
Right.
Um,
But they checked the boxes because it's in their own self-interest, right? As long as they don't get caught out in it, then you check that box and you improve your odds or whatever it might be.
yeah, exactly. And I think there's like, some people might be like innocently mistaken because stories
Yep.
have like been passed down to them all the way to people who are like, oh, like I'm going to get in on
Totally.
this like very tiny uh, gold rush, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um, so that, yeah, like part of what needs to change is the incentives and like what the standards are, because that's
Yeah,
one way that we can discourage people from partaking in this type of behavior in the first
totally.
place.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does feel like there's a small connection to the OpenAI story from this part where it's like OpenAI writes their founding document being like, we're gonna only do safe AI stuff, but the incentives end up, as they often do, messing with that plan to do good. And right, it's the same with having that checkbox on your form, right? You're trying to do right by Indigenous communities, and unfortunately, putting a checkbox on your form might not actually achieve that end, even if it's done with pure heart. You might
Yes.
accidentally just be providing a bunch of weird incentives for non-Indigenous people to uh, lie and confuse everything.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's like, yeah, I don't know, something about like the tangible material incentives. I think often outweigh whatever good intentions you might have written down.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think Buffy's 82 years old now, and that's part of why some people are like, "Why didn't you just leave her alone?"
Oh.
But
Hmm.
I think she will always have admirers. I think now she's going to be a controversial figure. There are some people that are going to want nothing to do with her anymore. But I think
Yeah.
her impact has been so large that she's gonna continue to have true believers on her side, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. That seems very likely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So next up, we wanted to discuss an article from The Atlantic written by Olga Kazan titled "These Teens Got Therapy, Then They Got Worse." The story starts by outlining a recently published study out of Australia where they assigned 1,000 Australian middle schoolers into either a treatment group where they taught a mental health class based on dialectical behavioral therapy, or a control group. And the results were not what they had hoped. The kids in the DBT group fared worse than their peers. And then the article gets into the broader idea that, in general, these broad based approaches to help teen mental health, they seem to fail.
Hmm.
Similar to how the DARE program failed to keep teenagers from doing drugs. And that lack of success is a pretty serious problem given the teenage mental health crisis. Uh,
Hmm.
so, Kier, what did you find interesting about this article?
Well, it really made me think of Jesse Singal's book called The Quick Fix: Why
Mm,
Fad Psychology Can't Cure Our Social Ills. Um, and it's really worth reading. But
hmm.
one of the things that really got at is that like institutions are so often looking for like cheap cure-alls, right?
Right.
And you can imagine like the appeal if it's like, oh, instead of individual students getting one-on-one support from, a highly trained professional, if
Right.
instead we can just have this assembly or classroom, treat 30 kids at once, and maybe the person presenting doesn't even have to be a therapist, right? We
Right.
can
Yeah.
pay them
We'll
less.
provide the PowerPoint and they just click through it kind of thing.
Exactly, just like
Hmm.
a well-being type of thing. Like that's going to be really appealing, even if it doesn't work and it like does
Right.
not
Yeah.
really help people the way, And I think it is also sort of a cautionary tale. This article is, that like just because something works, for people with these mental health issues in individual counseling sessions, you can't necessarily take that information, give it to healthy kids in a group
Right.
setting
Yeah.
and expect it to do the same thing.
Oh, totally. Yeah. That seems like I don't know. I feel like it's framed as if the researchers were like surprised or disappointed by this result, and I have to wonder how much that is true because I don't know. It feels sort of like a long shot to me. The idea that right DBT is a well studied and effective therapy in the the form it was made to be given in, right? Which I think is a
Mm-hmm.
combination of group therapy and one-on-one therapy, and for very specific issues that people might be facing. So the idea that like, oh, we'll just take the same ideas and we'll just teach them to everyone. I don't know. It would be great if it had worked, but it doesn't strike me as super surprising that that it didn't.
Yeah. And I wanted to say, like, there's a sentence in the article that says, in case it's not clear, although it's disappointing that the therapy program didn't work, it's commendable that Harvey and her colleagues analyzed it objectively and published the negative results. And I want to draw
Mm-hmm.
attention to that. There's something called like the file drawer problem or publication
Yeah,
bias, which is essentially that results not supporting the hypothesis of researchers often go no further than the researchers' file drawers and remain unpublished, right? So
totally.
if they find the finding they want, they submit it for publication. If they find a finding they don't want, we don't hear about it, right? Like it
Yeah,
doesn't make it into the journals. So
totally. I would
that's one
guess
really cool thing about this.
totally. I think usually if they're doing like 1,000 kid study, that's
Right.
probably going to get published either way.
It would be hard
But
to make that disappear.
totally. But no,
Yeah.
it's totally true. I think like the early. I imagine that this was a study that came out after like earlier, smaller scale studies showed some promise that got them the funding that they needed to do the larger scale study. But
Hmm.
yeah, no, I thought it was quite an interesting article. And I did find it interesting, the idea that it not only didn't help but seemed to make things worse.
Right. Let's talk about
I,
that.
yeah, so it was they measured sort of how the kids were doing on several axes, and I think they showed all of them to either have stayed the same or gotten worse, sort of immediately after treatment. And then I think they did like a 3-month follow up where pretty much everything had gone back to baseline, other than the quality of relationship with parents, which had
Yeah.
stayed lower even 3 months later. And I did end up reading the abstract of the paper, and it was very clear that like don't try this, it didn't work. Like there wasn't like uh a lot of studies end with like, we didn't quite get it this time, but we hope that more research happens in this area. This one seemed more
Right.
like we might have done some harm, back to the drawing board sort of result.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the author kind of ties in like other sort of challenges that we've found in supporting teenagers, right? That like,
Hmm.
I mean, I remember, I think I was like at the tail end of the DARE youth, the drug
Right.
abuse resistance education, and there was this giant biker guy, who
Mm.
just like screamed about heroin, that he'd been a heroin addict, and that like weed is a gateway drug.
Right.
Everyone who smokes weed will go on to, basically end up in the gutter, injecting heroin. And at the time, I was like horrified. We were all horrified.
Hmm.
And I couldn't help but think, like, there are people in this audience who have already smoked weed, right? And what
Right.
message are they getting from this? Like, oh, I'm already doomed. Like,
Right.
and also
Either I'm
just
already doomed or this guy's lying to us.
exactly, right?
Yeah.
And if he's lying about this, what else is he lying about? Maybe drugs
Right.
aren't bad at all, right? Like
Yeah, totally.
it was so over the top and such a like scaremongering approach to it that like
Hmm.
I just was like, I bet this has like unintended consequences. Like I don't
Totally.
think this is like a neutral experience people are having.
Well, and that's what I had to think with the like giving DBT style advice to a general audience, is that it's advice tailored to people who are like enduring pretty serious like distress and serious problems, and you have to wonder about the kids in that class who hadn't been worried about their mental health at the start of it,
Yes.
being told all of these uh, I don't know, being given tools to deal with a problem that they weren't facing. All of a sudden, are they going to be on higher alert looking for things that they can use the tools on? You know what I mean? And
Exactly.
I think a lot of mental health can come down to uh, sort of how you contextualize your own thoughts, right? Like someone who is severely depressed will take their sad thoughts more seriously,
Hmm.
maybe. And so leading a bunch of people to whose mental health is fine, asking them to take their mental health more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe maybe they'd be doing better if they're just, they were doing fine as they were and just not like turning that magnifying glass towards their mental health.
I
Might have been for the
agree.
best.
I agree with this so much. Like I am very skeptical of the idea that like absolutely everyone should be in therapy, that anyone who is not in therapy is a garbage
Totally.
person. And yeah, that there's no other ways that people can like tend to their mental health or learn communication skills or whatever it is.
Right.
I don't believe that, and I do think that there are specific cases where therapy could make things worse for people, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're like, ruminating over like your every interaction and like,
Mm.
you're like, oh, how do I make sure that I never fight with this person again? Oh, how do I have to like change my personality? And you're just like, ba, 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 ba. You're
Mm.
just spinning and spinning and spinning, you know,
Some
maybe
some
instead of
therapists will just
therapy, you should go play basketball
totally.
or take up
Yeah.
woodworking or
Yeah, and
like do literally anything else.
I think some therapists would give that same advice, and other
Yes.
therapists, especially somewhere like here where there's no qualifications required to be a therapist, might just be happy to wallow with you and act as though this like endless self-reflection is somehow going to yield better mental health. Some
Yeah,
therapists
exactly.
are just as tied up in that kind of thinking as their patients, and
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I
Yeah, I
did.
think I'd say I've personally experienced both. Therapists
Yeah,
who are like, "Ooh, let's talk about all the terrible things forever," and then therapists
totally,
who are like, "You know what? You seem fine. I think you should go hang out with your friends."
totally. Yeah, yeah, me too, actually. Yeah, I did. I thought there was one very clear policy change, which I would love to see, that
Hmm.
seems like it would help, which is it says that in many states, adolescents can't access any mental health care without parental consent.
Right. Yes.
And that seems like a very clear thing that could be changed to make a big improvement, because you have to think that there's overlap between the kids who don't feel comfortable talking with their parents and who need mental health support.
Yes,
and
that seems likely.
and being able to find a way for those kids to access support, and hopefully from trained professionals. And again, it's like in the context, I don't know, I've read a fair number of books about how to do therapy just for my own, to help myself, I guess. And a lot of it, something I've come, well, I'll go on a whole rant about BetterHelp sometime, but I think that a big part of the what can make therapy work is that the therapist has like uh, a toehold from the get go, because the patient has come to therapy, and so that means
Right,
something
they've
isn't
chosen
working.
it, right?
Exactly right. Just
Mm-hmm.
that it means like, if nothing needed to change, you wouldn't be here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be a big thing, and yeah, but you don't have that when you're just lecturing a classroom full of teenagers. But you would have that if a teen could, talk to an administrator and be like, I need some help. I think that could
Yeah, I totally agree. And
help
that seemed
people.
to be like another hypothesis sort of in the article, right? Is that like
Hmm.
teens don't like being told what to do, right? Like
Totally.
maybe that could be one of the reasons why this doesn't work is because they don't want to be told what to do. So,
Yeah.
if you're going to be in a very different place if someone like asks
Yeah.
for help, chooses help, And I did
Totally.
actually look it up, and it turns out in Canada we have a better situation
That's
where
good.
yeah, there's only two provinces that have like an age of consent around like mental health
Mm,
care. I think in healthcare in general, Quebec it's 14, New Brunswick it's 16. And from my
right.
understanding, all the other provinces and territories, it's like a case by case basis. And if the therapist feels
Hmm.
as though the youth has, the mental capacity to make the choice for themselves, then they're able to access it. And I think that's
That's
really
good.
great and maybe a
Totally.
model that could be replicated in the States.
Yeah. We could dream.
We can always dream. Yes. Yeah. I had one other
Hmm.
thought on this, which is just, recently, like, it seems that both Islamophobia and anti Semitism are being kicked
Mm.
up, and I heard on the national CBC News program that, there's going to be attempts in schools to like educate about these types of bullying and
Hmm.
harassment and counter them. And it made me a little worried. I don't like Islamophobia or anti Semitism, but basically, a lot of anti bullying programs seem to backfire, right? Because
Totally.
they bring attention to
Yeah.
stereotypes and they remind people,
But they
you
just
know,
remind kids that they can be bullies, I think is a big part of it, right? Like it
exactly.
might not cross your mind until
Like,
you
I've
go to the
never
lecture.
thought of making fun of so and
Yeah,
so in this way before,
totally.
but now that you mention it,
Yeah, totally. Well, and it's
yeah.
yeah, I'd be curious, like the Jewish or Muslim kids in those classes, uh, would they would they vote to have those classes or not?
Right. How do
I
they
don't
feel
know.
about
I don't
it?
know, but
Yeah.
I don't. It doesn't seem like a slam dunk to me that they'd be like, yes, I really want to be singled out as a bullying target and then told not to get bullied about it. That seems
Uh,
a bit more complicated. Again,
yeah.
I feel like it almost does tie into the same idea of like you can have clear intentions and do your best to uh, be clear about your plan and implement your plan. But if the incentives go the other way, or you haven't thought of certain edge cases or whatever, the your well laid plans can go very awry. And
Yeah,
it doesn't sort of matter.
absolutely.
It sort of doesn't matter just how nice or good your plans were, if the incentives or something you haven't considered don't align with your nice good plan to help teenagers with
Yeah,
their mental health.
exactly. Yeah, outcomes really matter. And they're not
Totally.
always what we expect. So we need to make
Yeah.
sure to circle back and see how things are
Totally.
going.
Well, and do studies like the one that this article is about. It's I don't know. I always think it's funny when there's an article that's like reporting a study that didn't go the way the researchers hoped it would, as if that's like a huge setback and not like how the process of research goes.
Right.
I don't know. In some ways, it's like, yeah, cool. I bet they'll come back with another plan that they do next year and use the lessons they learned here, and the march of progress will continue.
Yeah, maybe it's a good thing that looks like a bad thing.
Totally.
Nice. Yeah, so the essay I wrote last week was more personal than a lot of the stuff I write.
Yeah.
And it was called On the Arrival of Silver Hair.
Hmm.
Yeah, and basically it was about how like I've spent a lot of my life feeling a mismatch between how I feel and how old I am.
Mm-hmm.
When I was really small in preschool, I thought like my preschool teachers who had like crow's feet around their eyes and
Mm-hmm.
smile lines around their mouths were just so beautiful. And I like scrunched my face up trying to get those lines because I just thought that like it was evidence that you'd been so
Yeah.
happy so often, right? Um, and yeah, and I also like really wanted to be old. I wanted to be taken seriously, even when I was like
Right. Yeah.
5 years old. I was like very upset that I didn't get homework in kindergarten because I was ready to be a big kid.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, into my 20s, when I, started experiencing health problems, like, I looked super young and I felt positively ancient
Mm-hmm.
inside and, was as prone to injury as someone in their 80s.
Yeah.
So basically, now that I'm like in my early 30s and I see these silver hairs coming in, I just feel like finally maybe there's like a match between how old I feel and how old I look. And it feels very nice.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a beautiful piece you've written here. I really yeah, I found it very touching. And
Hmm.
yeah, I feel like it's not something we want to subject to the normal sort of hot take think tank arguments about wordings or that sort of thing. I'd say anyone listening, if you haven't read it, you should take some time out of your day and read it. I think I think it's well worth the read.
Thanks, Liam. Yeah, it's funny, like, because I have this Substack and I publish something every week, I've really become aware of the idea of audience capture, right? That, like,
Yeah.
you do feel like really good when you get lots of likes and comments and messages and, oh, yeah, this one really hit, you know? And it's tempting to, like, chase that, right?
Yeah.
But there's always the risk, right, that you're going to like kind of narrow down what you're writing about, and perhaps you're even going to try and be provocative and controversial and
Right.
really, you know, kind of pick at people, because that is the type of content that people respond more to, right? Like if someone just has like a calm like feeling, they probably won't say anything to you about it.
Totally. Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of took a chance with this. I was like, I knew the response would be a little quieter, but you know, I did get some like really touching responses from people who felt very moved by it. So yeah, I'm glad I put it out
Yeah.
there.
Totally. No, I think that's a very wise thing to do. Sort of not let yourself get too caught up in the numbers game of trying to get, you know, as many shares on Twitter or whatever that you possibly can with each article. Because yeah, I don't think you want to get sort of wrapped up in that. Yeah, that sort of race to make the most provocative content you can. Because that's just, I don't think that's the kind of person you are. You're not sort of uh you're not trying to go famous at any costs or anything like that. I
I'd really
think
rather not. It seems awful.
totally. Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. I mean, it does feel like the whole. Uh, I don't know. It makes me think again about just how incentives can affect things, right? And that you do have this incentive to write less beautiful things than this, and write instead things that make people angry or make people click. And yeah, I think it's admirable, sort of, that you can set those incentives aside and do what you know, what's more meaningful to you.
Yeah, I
I think
hope
it's
it's
great.
something I can continue to do for sure. I don't want to
Yeah.
toot my horn too much, but yeah, it feels really good, and it's something I want to encourage for other people too, right? It's like if you're putting your work out into the world, like it has to work for you. It has to be meaningful on some level for it to be like sustainable effort,
Totally.
right? So I think, yeah, trying to find that balance where you're like, you know, you are thinking about your readership without letting them like direct you. And I also think like the more honest you get, the weirder and truer to yourself you can get. Like it might take longer to find your people, but the people who do find you like you. They like what you're doing already, right? So you
Yeah.
don't have to
Totally.
strive to like fit into something else to please those people.
Totally. Yeah, and I think there's got to be something to be said for making content that you feel good about, regardless of how well it performs when measured by metrics. You know, sort of writing something that you think is a worthwhile thing to write, regardless of how it does. So that you're not constantly stuck on the trap of you know, writing something and then feeling bad about it if it didn't get enough views or whatever. It's yeah, there are other reasons to write things, and I'd say that probably most great writing wasn't done in the name of collecting views or email addresses. I think
Yeah.
it's usually yeah, usually the things that are written for personal reasons that end up being the most worthwhile to read.
Yeah, definitely. Like I think, yeah, the literary landscape would be much impoverished if the motivating factor for everyone was, the most the most engagement and yeah, having your own reasons for doing what you do provides a great foundation.
Totally. Well, should we wrap up with Liam's quiz?
Let's do it. I'm ready.
All right. So, this one inspired by the teen mental health article we discussed.
Hmm.
It made me realize I don't actually know the how common mental health problems are. Uh,
Mm.
so I wanted to look it up. And the World Health Organization is actually the source for this one. Um, and the question is, as of 2019, so pre-pandemic, they don't have good numbers since then, published yet at least. As of 2019, what percentage of the population of the world were living with a mental health condition?
Oh my gosh.
Uh,
Wow.
and it is, it's the World Health Organization, so they had to come up with like very specific definitions of everything. And
Hmm.
it's also an estimate because they didn't like administer like diagnostic tests to everyone, but it is sort of an estimate trying to get at like not minor things, but like diagnosable depression, right? Not
Yeah, having like a
uh,
serious impact on your life. Yeah.
totally.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I bet the numbers like really do vary like in different regions.
Yeah, or by
Um,
age is one thing I thought. Like I
right.
bet I have to think middle schoolers and high schoolers have among the highest rates.
Yeah, what a terrible time of life. um, yeah, I'm gonna say 10%.
Yeah, pretty darn close actually. 12.5.
Oh my gosh, is this
Yeah,
the first quiz that I've gotten
I
right?
think that's got to be the closest you've gotten so far. Yeah, 12.5, 1 in 8 or so. So about a billion humans currently alive with mental health conditions. But
Mhm.
yeah, you nailed it.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I do feel like when, I don't know, just certain times in my life, especially being younger,
Hmm.
it felt like almost everyone around me was like really seriously struggling, And
Totally.
I think, yeah, there were like different factors to that. Like most people were poor at that time.
Hmm.
A lot of people were queer and maybe had like strained relationships with their families or more likely to have that.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it really did. There was a time where I was like, is anybody okay? Like
Yeah,
it
I
really felt
definitely,
like that was not the case. But
yeah, I had that too. Just I feel like, the impression, I don't know if it comes from movies or what, that like everyone who has a normal job is like secretly depressed about it.
right.
Right? That like always, death of a salesman sort of thing where it's like you on the outside he seems to be doing fine, but I'm sure secretly he's really sad about everything. And it's like, well, I mean, for 87% of people, maybe they're
No,
actually,
it's fine.
yeah. I mean, they've got. I'm presumably most people have non-mental health related struggles, but in terms of depression, anxiety, that sort of thing, yeah, 1 in 8 or so.
That's cool. Yeah, yeah, it would be nice if it was lower, but it's nice to know that like a large majority of people are doing all right in that sense.
Totally. I guess it also makes me think too of that advice you mentioned earlier that like everyone would be doing better with therapy. It's like
Right.
even the vast majority who don't have any diagnosed mental or like not even diagnosable mental health things. Maybe, yeah, maybe not.
Yeah, maybe they're doing just fine.
And
Totally.
maybe going to therapy would make them feel worse, like that they did have problems that they wouldn't have had if they hadn't gone. It's possible.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely, I think it's the ruminating, right? Like if
Hmm.
someone does not ruminate and goes to therapy and starts ruminating, then you've got a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Or I'm just generally like pathologizing. I think would be the risk is like there are lots of. I mean that's part of what makes it so hard to diagnose or like to choose diagnostic criteria, right? Is that a lot of things that can mean clinical depression in one person can just be normal thoughts for someone else.
Yeah.
Like
Just
there's
having a bad day
yeah,
or something
totally.
really sad happens. So then you're sad for a while.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like it's definitely important to remember that yeah, it's the full spectrum of human emotions. It's normal to feel all of them at different points, right? It's really only if you get
Yeah,
like stuck in one and you can't find your way out. That's when it's a good time to find someone to help you out. But otherwise,
totally.
maybe just go for a walk.
Yeah, just have a good day, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, this has been Hot Take Think Tank. Until next time.